Alright, so now we talked about this kind of forms its own control, where saving and loading an app key and app ID is a very reusable component that will be used for all of the requests that we make. So we'll go ahead and refactor this into a control. We'll create a proper view model for this control. We'll implement Knockout to manage the binding into these text fields so that we can work with data more naturally than using jQuery to find input text boxes and read and write their values. We can just read and write data objects directly and know that Knockout will handle the binding aspect. So we'll do that now. So controls in MVC are typically found in the shared folder, and they start with the underscore because they're going to be a partial view. This is some reusable component that we're going to want to be able to drop on any page or potentially repeat within a page. Control kind of represents some bounded context that makes sense on its own. Saving and loading the credentials for these requests can be thought of a control that could be used to compose a greater control, like the string search control. So when I add this view, I'm going to name it with this control's name. So I'm going to say Leafly credentials. Again, we're not using the models in terms of MVC where the server is going to bind everything for us, so we're going to keep this empty. It is going to be a partial view this time, and that bunks out this other option. So now we're going to just move the control markup out of this view into this view, and then we can render it on this screen. So to render this control into here, I'm going to say add html.partial. Remember, do not put the semicolon here or it will render a semicolon in the markup. So now the markup has been moved into a partial view, but the behavior or the script aspect of it is still in this parent view. Given the way MVC works, we cannot have a render section scripts inside of here. I imagine if this was a repeater and this was included multiple times on the page, let's say in a table, this represented a row, then the script would be included multiple times as well. We know we don't want that. So these functions are the behavior of that control. So whenever we think of a control, we're going to also think of a view model. So our view model is going to deal with understanding when a user fills in credentials, when they ask for a save or a load. The view model is actually going to perform that. So if I were to create a view model using just plain JavaScript, I could say var VM is some object, and that object should have these functions available. The view model should also handle the state of the data that is bound into the control. In this case, the data being the app key and the app ID. So now let's add some properties for the app key and app ID on the view model. And you can see when the view model first loads, there's no value for the app key or the app ID. Now here's where things get a little bit hairy, is how do we make sure that the value in the text box is the same value that the view model has stored? Because we want to be working with the view model's data directly. We have these save and load functions. We could make these getter, setter, and every time the text box changes, we can have an event that updates this, and we can have a setter on this that updates the text box whenever it's set directly. And you know, that's just plumbing. We don't want to have to worry about all that kind of stuff. So that's where Knockout comes into play. So Knockout would say, I want to make app ID observable and whatever its value is, put it in a text box, and whenever the text box's value changes, update my value. That's all that Knockout does. It's a binding engine. And we talked about briefly understanding what components of your app do what. I like Knockout because it only does data binding. That's a very simple task for it to do, and it does it pretty well. I don't need all the other aspects that Angular provides, like routing, etc., because I have MVC. So to install Knockout, I'm going to use the package manager. Searching through NuGet can be tricky because a lot of things match Knockout, and I want the core library. So I'm going to open the console. I'm going to say install package Knockout.js. You can see Knockout has been added. We'll want to create a bundle for Knockout. There already is one. So Knockout is not added by default to all the pages. So we can either add it into the layout and say every page is going to use Knockout, or we can add it just to the pages that we want. I'll say this page uses Knockout. So we're going to render the bundle. And now we can use Knockout's types or classes or functions to say I have an observable value that is the app ID, and I have another observable value that is the app key. So now that I have these observable properties, I can go into the credentials control itself. So on this input text box, I say data bind the value to the app ID property of my Viewmodel. If that property is observable, it will be able to read and write from this text box. Now in HTML5, all data dash attributes, meaning an attribute whose name starts with data dash, are valid, and data dash bind is an attribute that Knockout looks for to determine how to bind data into the page. Now we can also bind the click functions, so that instead of saying on click, we'd say data bind the click function to this. Now this $data variable is the currently in scope context for this control. In this case, it would be the Viewmodel. So finally, we have to tell Knockout to actually perform a binding at some point. So we'll say when the page loads, call this function, and we will apply bindings to the page with the Viewmodel specified VM as the model we want to use. So now if I run this, so at this point, as soon as we enter in a value into the app ID, we should be able to see it in our Viewmodel. And we'll see the app key is still blank. Now I can set the app key pragmatically as well, and it'll show up in there. So that's the kind of read-write-ness of Knockout. So now at this point, I can click the Save button, and my new credentials should be saved. Now one of the other things that would be a little more challenging to do with jQuery alone would be I want to disable this Save button whenever one of these or both of these text boxes are empty. I'd have to set up a bunch of listeners in jQuery to see when different things changed, and if the condition was right, then disable it, and otherwise re-enable it. Knockout enables a very simple way of doing this with what they call computed variables. A computed variable is nothing more than a variable whose value depends on the state of another value. Now that's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's really simple. So if I say Viewmodel has credentials, and I want that to return true if both of these have a value, both the app key and the app ID. So I'm going to say this is a ko.pureComputed, meaning there's no side effects from calling this function. Don't have to really worry about what that means now. So the value of this observable should return true if both of these are not some sort of falsy value. So I can say return and Knockout will notice that app ID and app key are both observable and subscribe to their values and propagate any changes up to this computed value. So when this has credentials returns true, I want this button to be enabled, otherwise it should be disabled. So I'm going to say data bind also enabled to has credentials. And by default, this should be disabled, because until the credentials have been entered, this button should not be enabled. And it's important to think about those things because the binding will happen at some point. Now, if there are a bunch of things happening before the binding can complete, the markup might render some initial state which could be completely hokey. Often you'll notice this when a page loads and there's like an empty result table or something that disappears. You'll see that little bit of flicker. That's the page was not initially constructed into a proper state, and the bindings didn't happen fast enough, so the user observed the invalid state and then the bindings kicked in and it fixed itself. So it's always a good idea to think about this. This button should start disabled until credentials are loaded. Let's say in jQuery we just go ahead and call load credentials just in case when the page first runs. Just in case there's something in there, we want it to be there. As soon as they're loaded, that button will re-enable itself. And it might be fast enough that the user doesn't even notice anything. But the point is, let the page drive. Let the logic that you're building into your observables actually drive the page. So this load credentials function is currently using the jQuery approach to looking up the element by its ID and setting the value into the text box. So we don't need to do this anymore. Instead, all we have to do is update the observable on our view model, and same for the app key. And we'll do the same thing for save credentials. The other thing we want to do is use this has credentials instead of pulling the values and checking them. Let's have a better way of doing that. See when the page loaded, ABC was loaded in for the key and AAA for the ID. At this point, the save button should be enabled, so it's probably a mistake in the code somewhere. If we look, this binding that enables or disables the button is actually the enable binding, not enabled, so that was a small typo there. So I'm going to refresh the page again. Now we can see this button is enabled, and if I clear it out and then lose focus, we see the button gets disabled. If I put something back in and lose focus, it becomes re-enabled. That is not typically the behavior we'd like to see here. I'd like it to be as soon as this goes empty, this button is disabled regardless of the focus. Luckily there's a binding that we can apply to the text fields that will update the view model's property with each key press, which will cause the has credentials to recompute itself as well. So for each of these text boxes, I want to add the value update binding and specify it to after key down. Now if I refresh the page again, ABC is loaded back. As soon as I clear out the field and I still have focus, save is disabled. I lose focus, nothing happens. The second I put something back in here, this re-enables and stays enabled. I can save, clear it out, load it back, and everything behaves as I expect.